Okay, guys, I am so stoked for this one. I love Spider-Man.
Me too. I know I've said on the podcast a number of times I'm a big Spider-Man fan, so this is going to be a good one.
Guys, we're not covering Spider-Man.
Not covering Spider-Man.
What?
You said we were covering the movie about a normal guy who receives amazing powers by accident.
Right, yeah. A movie about a guy who puts on a red suit and dashes from building to building without touching the ground.
A movie about a guy with great power who has to take on great responsibility.
And he struggles navigating his personal relationships in light of his grand calling, Spider-Man.
Spider-Man.
No, guys, we are covering all those things, and we're covering the Santa Claus, the Tim Allen movie. It's this year's Christmas movie Patreon pick.
Oh shoot, we better go rework our notes.
Yeah, it's basically the same movie. So our listeners, I don't think they're going to notice the difference. And
Okay,
hey, maybe we should
you guys
cover.
got like 1 minute.
Okay, all right. And hey, maybe we should cover Spider-Man like next time.
In a world where entertainment is viewed as mindless diversion, only good for momentary distraction, one podcast has taken a stand, thoughtfully engaging the art of our day, dissecting the narrative, and pointing the people back to the greatest storyteller of all. You are about to enter a new world, and you will never view entertainment in the same way again. This is Popcorn Theology.
Welcome, film lovers and theology nerds, to episode 253 of Popcorn Theology. I'm James.
And I'm Miles.
And I'm David. And yeah, it's good to be on the same page now. And in the future, James, maybe instead of listing several specific attributes of the movie, you could just tell us like the name. This is clearly your fault.
Hey.
It was very confusing. We blame James.
I don't
James.
need to hold your hand. All right, guys. Just saying.
But yeah, we're covering the Santa Claus, the movie that is the reason why I spell Santa Claus wrong every single time.
Yeah.
Seriously?
I was going to say, I think it's partly because you don't see this name written down near as much, but I definitely did not get the pun in the title for a lot longer than I'd like to admit.
Oh, yeah.
Related to this movie.
Like 20 years I got that wrong. I've been thinking that there's an E in Santa Claus. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, the spelling of Claus gets weird, too, because sometimes it's spelled with a K and sometimes it's with a C. And I don't know. It's a whole thing.
I just don't even know what to do with you guys. First it's the movie wrong, then it's the spelling wrong. What's next?
This is the one with Tim Allen, though, right?
I thought we were doing It's a Wonderful Life.
Sore subject, dude. Too soon.
Too soon.
So yeah, this is our Patreon pick episode, which means that, once every 4 episodes, our patron saints vote on what movie we're going to cover. And around the holidays, we like to give them, the chance to pick a holiday themed movie. So they chose a Halloween movie and they chose a Christmas movie for us. And,
we'd already done Die Hard. So
yeah,
already done Die Hard.
It had to be something different.
And Batman Returns. And we're basically done with Christmas movies.
That's all of them. There's
That's
no
all of
others.
the ones. No, but this one was heated. There was the nominations. There were a bunch of nominations, and our Patreon saints seemed to like to play with us, and so there was a tie between It's a Wonderful Life and the Santa Claus. And then when we had the runoff, there was just an epic debate.
War.
Yeah,
There was just
I was going to say
a war.
I even tried to help with the tie, and so I contacted 2 people that I know aren't on social media but are patron saints to be like, hey, you should go vote. And unfortunately, I contacted 2 people, and they split the vote again. I was like, dang it, fail.
But it was great. Like the argument in favor of the Santa Claus, represented by Eric George. He says, okay, a movie about a guy who is pretty good but doesn't know it. Or a movie about a divorced guy having to come to terms with how he hasn't been a good father and that he's losing a relationship with his son. So one story is about you're fine just the way you are, It's a Wonderful Life. Or a story that you have wrecked every relationship you ever had, and if you don't change, you'll wreck the one you have with your son. So that's him saying, yeah, we definitely want to do the second one, the Santa Claus. And then in reply, Isaac is like, but that's where you're wrong. Movies about bad fathers realizing the error of their ways are a dime a dozen. It's a Wonderful Life provides an ideal opportunity to discuss what does good enough mean, and can you ever be good enough? So he fought pretty hard. And then, let's see, we had Bridget. She threw in an epic 5-paragraph argument in favor of It's a Wonderful Life, which we should probably have to save because I imagine that we will.
That sounds like a term paper. 5 paragraphs. In conclusion.
Yeah. But she addressed directly to Santa Claus, and she's like, and finally, when you talk about a movie whose message is you have wrecked every relationship you've ever had, and if you don't change, you'll wreck the one you have with your son, are you sure you aren't talking about George Bailey and It's a Wonderful Life? George is on the brink of ruining his marriage and making his 4 beautiful children hate him. The main difference between George Bailey and Scott Calvin is that George is able to reconcile his relationships with his family before the marriage ends, and while he still has a chance to influence his children the way his father influenced him.
Also, George Bailey didn't have access to a Rose Suchik Company letter, so there's that.
Rose Suchik letter. But there's these, where these two movies cross is this theme about dads either under threat of losing their family or their family's already split up, which is a pretty common theme in 90s comedies, right?
Yeah, I was going to say this is, not that It's a Wonderful Life is it falls into that same category, but there were a bunch of movies in the 90s dealing with divorce, which I think is interesting because I think we've covered many of these. Certainly not all, but many of these. Mrs. Doubtfire we did an episode on, and that's another example of somebody undergoing some pretty serious change in order to stay in their kids' lives, although in his case it was intentional. And then Liar, Liar, which we haven't covered. Jingle All the Way. I'm actually a little surprised that didn't get nominated, but I'm also very, very glad it didn't get nominated. I need the Turbo Man doll.
These themes that come up around Christmas with I think maybe it comes with the over marketing of all the presents. This also seems to bring up the stress of providing for your family, and so Christmas movies often have this struggle underneath it where you're wrestling with the dedication to your career versus your family, and so there's a lot of that in there too. Like I believe
for sure.
Yeah, we've covered Hook, and then I think Christopher Robin you put in here.
Yeah. Those are some, and we actually did a theme that month, I believe, or some sort of theme overall related to this idea of dads, trying to focus on family versus the career. And Christmas is, of course, an ideal time to do that because you can summarize in one scene what would normally take a more involved series of events to show. It's all you have to show is the dad staying late at work on Christmas Eve, and you're good to go. That shows what he cares about, as opposed to a movie like Hook, where they had to be a little bit more elaborate with it. He misses the baseball game instead, but still pretty straightforward. So yeah, I mean, there was definitely this trend in the 90s, especially related to and kind of parallel with that idea of focusing on work over family is how to care for your children despite a divorce, and so that's pretty interesting.
It's sad in a way, seeing that you guys were putting that idea into our notes in the 2000s, unrelated but related. I remember having conversations about how many movies were about the lack of a father, and sometimes due to death, but other times because just raised without. There's absentee father figures in a lot of films in the following decade, and it's kind of sad in one sense to think that. Is this a logical next step of the issues of the 90s, right?
Yeah.
And on top of that, I would say then, it's like, well, look, in the 90s, we've got all these movies that you would have hoped inspired, but yet then we have all these movies still chronicling the increasing problem of absent fathers in children's lives, especially in our country. If statistics are to be understood and interpreted the way it seems like they are, it's interesting and probably good to note, maybe even just for our listeners, like, movies may reflect our culture, and I think some people think, especially the Hollywood regime, thinks that they inspire change. I remember Jon Stewart actually kind of mocking them for that when he hosted the Oscars a little bit. like movies may reflect culture, but I'm not sure they really do much to change the culture. They may report on it a bit, and they may report the problems,
Yeah.
but I don't think entertainment or even education saves a culture. And that's why we do what we do here, right? We believe we need to connect this to the gospel because that's the only thing that really brings good change.
Amen to that.
And it's like I kind of miss this theme in movies in the 90s where you had people struggling to try to hold or put their family back together. You don't see too many, like the 90s, just a generation after, no-fault divorce and all these steps legally in our culture. Now we had the fallout of, okay, our holidays, there's so many broken families, so this is a theme that we run through. Like a scene in this movie that's just when he goes to Denny's with his son and he sees all of these fathers who have burnt the turkey and they're sitting there. It's really sad. It's funny the way they portray it, like burnt the turkey and the guy waves with his burnt hand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you see these guys struggling to hold their family together, and everybody is just so sad on Christmas.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I almost wish, and maybe this would have been a little too on the nose, but I almost wish that we had seen something with those. I mean, because there's a bunch of kids later on in the movie, and maybe I just didn't look close enough. But if there had been something with those fathers and those kids later in the movie, I wouldn't have hated that. Even if it was just them waving at Santa as he flies by, you know what I mean? Like in that one scene, like turns out they all live on the same street or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah.
That I could have done with that because you're right. That's a bit of a nod to the notion that you're far from alone in this. There's people dealing with all sorts of brokenness in their families and in their relationships, and trying to navigate that in the holidays is particularly tricky. But man, I tell you, those scenes with Charlie early on, because I watched it, of course, in preparation for this, and my family, we love this movie, so I've seen it a lot. But it didn't occur to me how much Charlie did not want to be with his dad on Christmas until the last viewing, because he's just like, do I have to stay? Please come get me. I mean, when the sun comes up, come get me.
Yeah, well, as soon as the sun comes, you come get me. And imagine what that would feel like to hear from your kid.
That sounds horrible. I mean, and that yeah, exactly. That sort of sets the stage, if you will, for the relationship that we see going into this movie, which is, part obviously man becomes Santa Claus. Spoilers. Man becomes Santa Claus and struggles with that, but also an interesting commentary on the nature of belief and what does that entail? What does that look like for a child, for an adult? And then, kind of couched with the weighty issue of custody of this child and what's best for him and the parents and all of that. I mean, honestly, this is a movie that appears to be very superficial, but in reality is pretty heavy and weighty. And I know there was some frustration because we're going with this movie in the group and in the Patreon group, and not to name names, but there are a few people with some pretty strong words for not being happy that this one won. But I think what's exciting about it is that even a movie that appears to be pretty goofy and superficial can have some really important things to say about, like you guys were saying, the culture, and some important things for us to either, I forget the actual terms you guys have been using lately, redeem, receive,
and reject.
Receive, reject, and redeem. And I think that this movie probably has a bit of each, and that's been really fun to dig out. And so, maybe next year or sometime before then we can cover It's a Wonderful Life. But for now, we're going with the Santa Claus.
And I like in the midst of all these themes the way they play the comedy of Charlie hates spending time with his father, and then enter Neil, this compassionate, listening guy who's both the antagonist to the lame version of Scott Calvin, but also the skeptical antagonist to the Santa Claus persona throughout the movie. He's like this great foil. And I just love all throughout this movie the jabs that Scott throws at Neil. It's great. Neil's head comes to a point.
I love all the sweater.
Nice sweater.
All the sweater jokes. I was gonna say that was a very mid '90s kind of deal. It's funny that you took that Neil was this compassionate, listening father figure, because it's yes, you're not wrong, but at the same time, we're clearly meant to not like this guy from the start. We see him honking the horn, being like, "We're late, let's go." But it's so funny. Have you guys seen the Santa Claus 2 and 3?
Yeah,
I haven't seen 3.
So they change a lot from this one. They come out like 8 and like 12 years later or something like that. But what they do with Neil's character is like everything's fine. Like everything's fine going forward. Spoilers. Yeah. He's just like, hey, how's it going? He's just like the kind of goofy, fun, like Judge Reinhold kind of character that you might expect him to be. But that's all kind of in light of what happens in this movie, which is fascinating to me because, yeah, he had a lot to carry in this in terms of, like you said, kind of trying to gently keep this boy grounded. But then we discover a bit more later as to why Neil is the way he is. And at the same time, be a punching bag for Tim Allen. So
it's so Scott Calvin's about to lose custody of his son. Charlie's been up pretending to be Santa Claus, and I think Laura is the mom's name. He's jumping up and down on his bed in galoshes, and then Scott, I don't care what Neil's doing. Tell me about Charlie.
Yeah. Tell me about Charlie. Yeah.
It's just so mean. That's so mean. Yeah.
Also, for me, I'm a huge Home Improvement fan. And so for me to see this like dead center of Home Improvement's like peak success and all the references to Home Improvement in this, repeatedly the same type of humor. He puts on a tool belt once or twice. He even has like a very similar voice. And that's why you want to keep a fire extinguisher in the kitchen.
Yes.
So yeah, it was a very...
Well, not to mention his ho 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 sounds suspiciously like his ho ho ho.
Yeah. So this was pretty peak Tim Allen for me, I suppose.
Well, before we get any deeper, and it's an old movie, so we don't have to worry too much about spoilers, but before we get into things like the Santa tradition and how Christians feel about that, and then some of the themes about belief you're talking about, should we hang our ads by the podcast with care in hopes that people will still be back after to see what we to listen and hear? That's a really tortured Christmas
trying to come up with a rhyme on the
say.
spot's pretty good.
That was pretty good. I'll take that. So
let's do it.
Put on our kerchief and our caps, and then settle our brains for a long, hopefully not too long podcast.
There you go.
This episode of Popcorn Theology is brought to you by Missionalware. Missionalware has a large selection of high-quality apparel, drinkware, art, and more, all from a Reformed Christian perspective. Check out missionalware.com and tell them Popcorn Theology sent you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Popcorn Theology. If you want to hear more from us, subscribe on iTunes or your favorite podcast catcher.
Also, follow us on Facebook and Twitter and share this episode with your friends.
Assuming you have friends. To sponsor more content like this, consider supporting Popcorn Theology through Patreon. Then you'll make some friends.
For just $1 a month, you can have friends. You can become a patron saint and be added to our exclusive Facebook group, where you can interact, influence, and vote on future episodes of the podcast.
Well, let's get back to the episode.
I'm dreaming of a white Christmas, just like the ones I used to know.
And we are back. We've got some cocoa and cookies and soy milk, I suppose, maybe for some of us, as we continue our way through the Santa Claus, which of course begs an important question for parents this time of year. Miles, I think that your kid is young enough, and I know my kid is still a little young for discussion related to Santa Claus. But I'm curious, James, have you had a lot of parents ask you, what do you do about all the Santa Claus business as Christians? Like, how do we as Christians interact with this concept of Santa Claus? And if so, do you have kind of a standard advice that you give? Or how do you engage with that?
Well, I do. Mine definitely comes from being raised by Christian parents even before I was a pastor. And I believe mine handled it in a way a little bit different, but not wholly unusual. They split, my mom and dad split the difference between telling us or letting us assume that Santa was real, but also they didn't forbid Santa traditions. We left out the cookies and milk. My father, I don't remember, it must have been at a very early age, brought us into the idea that it was a fun mythology. Just like reading Lord of the Rings, just like reading, Tolkien. I mean, like there's something in us that loves and almost wishes to one degree that Aslan was real. And I mean, my goodness, even though I knew Transformers was fiction, there was a part of me as a kid that's like, but what if one morning I woke up and like I could go to Cybertron? Like I think as a child you have a thin line there, and so I don't even remember spoiling it for other kids. And so we were taught about Santa with a wink, is the way I would put it. It was like, well, let's leave the milk and cookies out. Wink. And so we always felt like we were in on the fun with our parents and experiencing it as a tradition that was rooted in fiction versus Jesus, which is tradition and life lived off of reality. So we were always in there. That's my recommendation for parents, is then you never have to. I think they also instilled at some early age a respectful way of dealing with other kids. Because, my brother and I didn't run around and spoil it. Ha ha, you're wrong. Your parents are stupid. Right? It was kind of that one of those first experiences of being in the world but not of it. And respecting, kids and parents around us, but also knowing ourselves, like this is very fun make-believe. Because I think about it, kids are going to love Superman, love Spider-Man in the same way. It's not like you can't enjoy Santa in the right context as a family. But do you want to face that situation where you tell them Santa's real and Jesus is real, and then find that day when you have to say, well, now let me parse this for you differently?
Yeah, I mean, that's
Sure.
that's exactly it. My parents, they went all out for Santa. It was pretty awesome, really. It was so much fun, really. But like my dad's friends, they would call each other's kids and pretend to be Santa, and get the list.
Nice.
And like my parents
Wow.
have video of me like shaking after having like had a conversation with Santa Claus. Like, and like they one time they left a video camera up and caught video evidence of Santa Claus, and then like Santa Claus touches his nose and the screen went all like white noise. And
Are you telling me your parents want like all Paranormal Activity with you
kind
on
of, yeah.
Santa Claus?
Yeah, it was awesome. It was really awesome.
You put flour on the floor and there's like boot marks across it. Holy crap.
Yeah.
Oh, my
That's
goodness.
elaborate.
So I struggle with precisely that, is that I had so much fun with it. My parents had so much fun with it. But there is that point where you go, Santa is more real to kids than Jesus is in a lot of cases, right? Because the presents are there, that kind of thing. And so
Right.
it's like a genuine struggle about how far to go with that. But
That's fascinating.
yeah, it's just difficult to wrestle with how seriously to take it, while also putting Christ first, honoring Him, and not wanting to cause your kids to stumble.
For sure, yeah.
Well, people who throw it out entirely, to me, seem to be missing an opportunity to look at the reality behind it, because Santa Claus is a product of church history, actually, right? And
Yeah.
I think, Miles, you've probably done the most study on this just this week to sort of
Oh
bone
yeah,
up.
gearing up for this week, I followed a historian named William J. Federer. He wrote a book called "There Really Is a Santa Claus," and then subtitled "The History of Saint Nicholas and Christmas Holiday Traditions." And the cool thing about this is, if you follow the story of Santa Claus and the traditions through church history, you learn a lot of church history, and there's a lot of theology involved. And so Saint Nicholas is the foundation for our Santa Claus tradition. And the way it was explained is Saint Nicholas is to the Greeks and the Greek Orthodox Church as maybe Saint Peter is to Rome, or Saint Patrick is to Ireland. They just love this guy. That's why you have so many Greek Orthodox people, so many Russians name their kids Nicholas, in the same way you might see a bunch of Irish people named Patrick. And so the story goes
Anita,
that
Diane, and Nick. Anita,
Nick.
Diane, and Nick. Nick, Nikki. And I am Gus. Sorry, go on.
Exactly. It's exactly. So the story goes that St. Nicholas was born under heavy persecution as a Christian. So he's born in about 270, 280, where there was an emperor, Diocletian, who somebody told him, like, you lost this battle because you've forgotten the old gods, and he hammered Christians. And then St. Nicholas grew up around this tradition of pietism, where it's people would go off into monasteries, and they would obey this command to sell all you have and give to the poor. So they would live in poverty, live off of alms, and go into these caves, the caves which were useful when you were being persecuted. And so that's his view of Christianity. But then a plague sweeps through, and Nicholas's parents die, and he inherits a bunch of money. And so, what do you do with all this money, given that that's the way he feels like he should follow Christ? And
Wait! Don't you put it in a big money vault and then swim in it like Uncle Scrooge?
just like
Duck,
Uncle
yeah.
Scrooge, yeah.
Yeah.
And so he receives great wealth or great power comes great responsibility. I'm sorry, I'm still stuck on Spider-Man mode. But he wanted to give anonymously. He wanted to give credit to God, which is also a very biblical concept.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, and this is one thing that I've noticed is somewhat lacking in modern times, is this notion of anonymous giving. Matthew 6 talks about giving to the needy. When you do that, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. So your giving may be in secret, and then your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And so if we make too public an act of our giving, Scripture says that we have our reward from that. And whether that's an ominous threat or whether that's a threat simply of, that's it, that's the extent of your reward. We're promised a greater reward if we actually give so anonymously.
It's a tricky balance, isn't it? Because Matthew 5, he says, in the same way, let your light shine before others so they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who's in heaven. I love that tightrope that Scripture puts us on, where it's like, okay, wait, I want to inspire others to emulation, so I need some things to be seen so that people will see, like, oh, he loves Jesus. I should follow in those footsteps. They're very healthy and very helpful. And yet at the same time, God knows it goes to our head, right? So like we should also be doing probably what we let people see should be the tip of an iceberg to what we're really doing. Maybe the iceberg metaphor. I hadn't really thought about that before. That it's very North Pole-esque. So
I'd say very seasonal. Very seasonal. James.
Yeah, the theme runs deep. But radical generosity and anonymous giving.
Yeah,
these are things that are deeply Christian. I was talking to a kid in my apartment complex last Christmas. I was just trying to figure out kind of a creative way to evangelize. And I said, hey, what'd you get for Christmas? Talked about it, and what do you got? Skateboard, this or that. And then I said, do you know why we give gifts on Christmas? I was like, it's because on Christmas we celebrate that God gave us Jesus, and we want to be like him. And that's not, like, strictly speaking, I was half inventing that, but really the true spirit of Christmas, I would argue that's a really good candidate for the true spirit of Christmas.
Yeah.
But as you keep going through history, even back in the 300s all the way up, people were kind of debating over this. What is this true spirit of Christmas? What is this kind of... And at the time, they celebrated St. Nicholas Day, not exactly on Christmas. He died on December 7th or 6th, and that's when they would celebrate him. But as the story goes, so St. Nicholas has all this money, and you'll see more of the traditions emerge in this. There was a local man who went bankrupt, and back then, when the creditors came, they didn't just take your money. They didn't just tax you or put a lien. They would take all your stuff, and they would take your children and send them into slavery. So this guy, in order to try to save his daughters, wants to marry them off before the creditors come. But he doesn't have a dowry. And so Nicholas hears about this, and anonymously he goes in at night and throws money through a window, and as the story goes, it landed in some shoes or stockings that were drying by the fire.
Great shot.
Great shot, Nicholas. And he did this 3 times in a row. Story goes that he got caught like the 3rd time, and Nicholas demanded that the guy keep him anonymous and give the credit to God. And so this is where we get gift giving. The general Christian generosity gets focused into celebrating and emulating Saint Nicholas, and this is where this story comes from. Another interesting thing about Saint Nicholas is that he punches heretics, which is just one of my. And so there's a line in the Santa Claus which is just wonderful. My wife pointed it out to me when we watched it this time. So Neil, Scott comes in and Neil's going to stop him. And he's like, "Would Santa really beat somebody up?" And Scott goes, "I'm this close." Fighting with Neil.
I've done it before.
I've done it before. And when did he do it before? In 300 AD, when Emperor Constantine legalizes Christianity. There's this heresy that pops up called the Arian heresy by Arius. I forget what his other name is. Do any of you guys know what the Arian heresy was?
Does it have anything to do with the Third Reich?
Nope.
Then no, I don't.
They decided Jesus was very blonde with blue eyes. No.
Blonde, blue-eyed Jesus.
But they did.
In that case, I still see that heresy quite a bit.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go.
Right? Arian heresy, yeah, it was the idea, really a downgrade of Jesus in that the Son of God was not co-eternal and consubstantial with the Father, right? So you have the idea that Jesus is a created being and made, and that there was a time when the Son was not, which kind of really screws up some readings of John chapter 1, in my opinion, and in a lot of other people's opinion, because I'm not alone. He was, right, Arius is condemned as a heretic, and we see some of that turn up in other distortions today, right? Jehovah's Witnesses would be kind of in a very similar boat of redesigning Jesus to be a created being.
Mm-hmm. And so what happens in church history is that St. Nicholas is a part of this Nicene Council, because Constantine's like, look, I legalized Christianity, and now you guys are dividing, which Christians aren't known to do, divide over things. But Constantine's like, you guys need to figure this out. So they call this council, and they come together and decide many different things of just like, okay, what is this going to look like in the Roman Empire now that Christianity is legal? And one of those things is they produced the Nicene Creed. And the Nicene Creed is very special, I think, in terms of Christmas, just for me, in that it's a creed that is affirmed by nearly every Christian on the planet. So Catholics will affirm it, Protestants will affirm it, Greek Orthodox will affirm it, and it's largely establishing Trinitarian doctrine, which is like what James has pointed out, is that no, Jesus is co-eternal with the Father, like light from light, begotten, not made. All of these phrases were first officially affirmed as a large group. I mean, they were around for since the beginning, if you just read your Bibles. But the Nicene Creed is something that really unifies Christians, which is kind of another spirit of Christmas thing, is this vague sense of unity,
Wait, so you're saying we're either on the Nicene list or the naughty list?
The Nicene. Touche. Touche.
It's funny as well. You mentioned this whole. So, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, because
go ahead.
There's a fist fight. There's a fist fight brewing, and I want to hear more about the fist fight.
Oh, the fist fight!
I'm learning a lot today, guys. This is great.
Saint Nicholas got so heated that he went up and smacked Arius in the middle of this council. And so
Nice.
one of my favorite things that I share a meme almost every Christmas since I learned this is it has like this old school picture of Saint Nicholas, like from a church, and it just says like, I came to bring presents for children and to punch heretics, and I'm all out of presents. And it's just like
Well, and I want to say as well that I saw this tweet going around, and I think it was by the Church Curmudgeon. Maybe you guys saw this, and it's I believe it's supposed to be to the tune of Old Saint Nick, which I don't remember the melody, so you'll have to forgive me as I limp through this. But I got the lyrics here from this tweet. Up at Nicaea, bishops pause, Arius and Santa Claus. One claims a time when the sun was not. One says that's a heretical thought. Ho, 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 who's gonna go? Ho, 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 who's gonna go? Off with the right hook, good Saint Nick. Down goes the dirty heretic.
Nice.
So I don't know if you guys saw that or not, but I was like, I got to pull that tweet up here as long as we're covering this.
So when Neil says, would Santa beat somebody up, and Scott says, I'm this close, actually, I mean, he had good case to just follow through.
he had a good case, good historical case, if he knew his.
Maybe that's what the mitts were for.
If he knew his church history. You don't believe in Santa Claus? Right hook. Or another thing that's interesting is there's this scene where Santa is in the police interrogation, and the detective is trying to get him to confess to be Scott Calvin. And so the detective says, what's your name? And he says, Kris Kringle. Name, Sinterklaas. Name, Père Noël. Baba Natalia. I don't even know how to this one. Pelsnickel? Pelsnickel?
Topo Gijo.
I remember that one. Topo Gijo. And then he says he has this funny smile. And so Scott Calvin is naming off all these names. But if you actually take a look at all these names, you get some good popcorn theology thoughts. So Santa Claus, okay, where does that come from? That comes simply from a Dutch pronunciation of Saint Nicholas. So it's like Saint Niklaas or something like that. Kind of becomes Santa Claus. Or Kris Kringle. Where does that come from? Well, that comes from year 1500. We got a couple. We're all Protestants on this podcast. In 1500, you have Martin Luther launches the Protestant Reformation, and at the time when he's rejecting a lot of Catholic beliefs, he's getting rid of all the celebration of saints. And so at that time, you have people, they still like Saint Nicholas, the like giving, and so he rejects these saints, and he goes, no, we don't credit saints for generosity, we credit Jesus. And so he would call it, the real person who's responsible for the generosity and the gifts is not Saint Nicholas bringing presents, it's Christkind, I think. Christkind, maybe would be the way to put it. Christ from Christ, obviously, and kind for like child in German, like kindergarten. So Christkinder becomes Chris Kringle. And so when Santa Claus is calling him Chris Kingle, he's saying, I'm Christ. I'm Jesus.
Nice.
Which is, and so at a time when people are, that's like another, year 1500, a reason for the season type debate that was happening even in the Reformation. Not Saint Nicholas, not Santa Claus, not this tradition, Jesus. And so even Martin Luther's having that same fight. Or similarly, another thing I learned is famously Henry VIII becomes a Protestant not because of doctrinal conviction, but because he wants another wife.
Yeah.
And so he brings the Reformation to Britain. And Britain had these Roman roots. And so Henry is also getting rid of the celebration of all the saints. And he wanted to keep a feast during the winter months because people like that. So he appeals back to Saturnalius, the celebration of Saturn.
Oh, yeah.
And at that time, the depiction of Saturn was like this fat, jolly, bearded guy with a wreath in his hair, like a Roman wreath. If you think of the Christmas Carol with the ghost of Christmas Present who comes, that's like a depiction of Saturn. It's been changed, Christianized. And so that's where we get the fat and jolly from. Is even that has church history, although it's not the best church history. And eventually this party became so raucous that the Puritans, when they settle like Massachusetts, they actually put a law in the book that says you can't celebrate Christmas.
Having too much fun, people.
Too much fun. It's like a Mardi Gras type thing.
Which, granted, that they probably were.
We're gonna cap you. We're gonna cap you guys off.
We don't need any Christmas beads, right? We don't need.
And it's this
Getting a little
this
carried
book
away,
keeps going
yeah.
on. The book is 300 pages. I'm just summarizing stuff I learned from podcasts. Even the reindeer thing has a Christian connection. And so we read in Revelation 19, Jesus comes on a white horse to bring the white throne judgment.
Yeah.
And in Revelation 20, there's a book of record, and then another book, a book of life. So there's a book that records all of your naughty deeds, and then there's a book of life for those who have received faith in Christ. So there's two books. This is where we start getting the naughty and nice list. And you're like, well, what does this have to do with St. Nicholas? Well, in Revelation 19, who's following Jesus is an army clothed in white riding on horses. And so St. Nicholas, he's a saint. He's a part of the saints coming, right? And so people are kind of melding these ideas together. So St. Nicholas rides a white reindeer. Well, where does the reindeer coming from? In Norway, they didn't have horses, but they did have reindeer. And so the great white throne judgment becomes naughty and nice list. The white horse becomes a reindeer. And Nicholas is not here for the final great white throne judgment. He's here for these yearly checkups. And so heaven kind of becomes the North Pole, and the North Pole becomes solidified in the Civil War when they're celebrating these things because North is superior to the South. These things all come together.
The American Civil War?
Yeah, the American Civil War. So we're just marching through history here. And then you even have, like, there's a famous, apparently, painting, like a propagandistic painting that has Santa Claus coming from the North, wink, wink, pole.
That sounds like Yankee propaganda to me.
Sounds like
I don't know
Yankee
about you guys, but that's.
And you even have, who serves along Saint Nick is a bunch of servant spirits. The elves are kind of like angels, and so all of these images have been roped in and kind of watered down to produce Saint Nicholas. And finally, he ends up getting his big red suit because of the Coca-Cola Company in the late 1800s, early 1900s.
Aha.
So all of this
It
puts
wasn't
together.
it wasn't just Coca-Cola, as I recall. Didn't it have to do with Norman Rockwell as well?
I can't remember.
Maybe they were more involved than I thought.
The Coke Rockwell conspiracy.
Yeah. But all of this, like, by the time we that's right. I'm just saying that, but by the time we get Santa Claus it's this weird mix of wonderful Christian themes as well as cultural battles for around 2,000 years. And it all started from a guy who was born in 280, died in 340, punched heretics, was responsible for the Nicene Creed, inspired generosity with people, and this figure who's inspired all these names for Nick among Greek people. I think he's even tangentially responsible for the New York Knicks because a bunch of people from Holland settled New York. So Santa Claus, all this history is to say, like, this figure is important to us, and it's undoubtedly Christian, even if it's mixed with the culture. Yeah. And for me, just doing this little history bit made me a little more comfortable that it's always been a little weird celebrating Saint Nick. There's always been a little mixture of the reason for the season. Should we keep Saint Nicholas? Where's the good and the bad? And you got to, kind of like we do in this podcast, reject, receive, redeem the Saint Nicholas tradition.
So then it takes the 90s to add in the new part of the mythology, right? Which is if Santa falls off a roof, then someone actually takes over.
Yes.
As the little brat said, so if I want to be Santa one day, all I have to do is push you off a roof. I'm like, yes. The kid's not wrong. It's an oversimplification of events, but yes. Also, you have the notes here, 280 to 340. He had quite a life then.
That's a pretty good run.
He's 60. He
he'd been in prison a couple times.
He got a lot done in 60 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's interesting. 60. You mentioned the Coca-Cola thing. I know part of that goes to the paintings done by Norman Rockwell for the Saturday Morning Post. The iconic red and white look that we now associate with Santa Claus, I believe, he's responsible for. And then a lot of the mythology was really solidified. I'm just kind of adding on to the more modern side of it. Yeah. In a book/poem that was referenced in this movie, Clement Clark Moore's "'Twas the Night Before Christmas," a visit from St. Nicholas. And growing up, our family didn't really do Santa Claus in all of these types of ways. My grandparents really tried hard to get us into Santa Claus, and I think they just were a little late to the game, I suppose. But we did every year try to quote this poem. And rely on the book when we inevitably tripped up on some of the more odd lingo, like arose such a clatter, for example. Dama in her kerchief and I in my cap had just settled our brains for a long winter's nap. It's a fantastic poem, but like a lot of the mythos that we see in this movie goes back to that particular story by Clement Clark Moore. So I just thought that was interesting that, it really is sort of the making of a myth, kind of getting up to this point. And honestly, anything can become an idol, because I often see Christians today that are really diehard on one side or the other. Like, let them celebrate Santa,
Christmas,
reckless. Nice. Yippee-ki-yay. And then you have some on the other side that are like, no, we're going to tell everybody Santa's not real. Send our kids to school. Let them be ambassadors for this. And it's like, is it possible you're choosing the wrong battle? That would be my sort of statement on that. If you're more interested in doing that than in sharing the gospel, or perhaps trying to find ways to redeem this aspect of the culture, then I think that your priorities probably need some revisiting, I guess. But anyway, that's a good sort of prequel, I guess, to the episode today.
David, if my Starbucks cups don't say Merry Christmas, I need to go to war.
I'm going to burn this place down. People will like fight over or use and abuse these kind of symbols, but like one of the missions of our podcast is just to be mindful, and it seems like if you're mindful, you can navigate these things as you go. But similarly, like the characters in this movie are accusing Scott Calvin. It's like the mom's like, if you can't be a Father of the Year, why not be Father Christmas,
Father Christmas?
Now you're just using this cultural symbol to reconcile with your son, and you're damaging him. Because all of this Santa Claus, Father Christmas stuff is used in this movie to have this closer relationship, which is the reconciling of a relationship with father and son. Son who hates him at the beginning of the movie, to a son who loves him and would run away from everything just to follow him at the end of the movie.
Well, it's a big problem, isn't it? I mean, we talked about this earlier, but divorce is a big deal, not just to the life of a child, not just between two spouses, but a movie that deals with this can be very important for Christians to talk about as families with your kids. Malachi 2 says God hates divorce. Like this subject, one of the crux issues in this film is the brokenness that comes from that, and Scripture talks to that pretty severely in a lot of different ways.
And like in a lot of ways, Jesus lets off burdens from the Old Testament, but he seems to turn up the heat in the New Testament about divorce. There's just the I wish that the church in particular, that we did a better job of being the type of people that help refuse relationships that have been broken. And if you don't see too many movies lately about people who got divorced and become reconciled and remarry, and be like, and that is a story that, you have verses that are literally about that in 1 Corinthians, right? But in this movie, a lot of it is about just kind of making do once we've gone through this incredibly fierce custody battle. Because as this movie progresses, he starts taking on the Santa Claus, and it feels like it's getting worse, because now everybody thinks he is like turning his kid into like this little Santa Claus cultist.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a good point. Is in older movies, I'm thinking of like The Parent Trap, especially the original Parent Trap. The idea was, you can have divorce, but they got to get back together. So it's a pause, it's a break. We're on a break, but it can't stay divorced and illustrate divorce as acceptable culturally. That was very taboo. And honestly, there's a lot of beauty to that, because that's what we should be seeing is reconciliation. You enter a relationship till death do us part. That being said, I personally appreciate this 90s trend of showing divorce well, because ultimately there are just causes, there are just reasons that divorce can take place. It's still awful. It's still a broken thing, but there are plenty of situations where people are unfortunately better off in a divorce situation than staying in their current marriage. Although ultimately that is because of the brokenness in that particular situation in that family. And so, the movies we mentioned earlier, especially Mrs. Doubtfire, really jumps out at me as a movie that shows a couple that are struggling through a divorce, trying to prioritize their kids and do what's best for them, which, I mean, ultimately, I think that is a strong thing, and especially important for kids to see and for families that are divorced to see. And so I'll defend that personally, because I think that there's a time and a place.
Well, sometimes God brings healing and transformation and a form of reconciliation after things have already been broken and changes have been made that are then irrevocable, right? I mean, like in some of these instances, we see in certain films, we'll see that there's been divorce or tragic stories in the past, but now there's remarriage, things are reformatted. Like, it can't be restored. Like, restoration can't be the outcome. But how do you live in reconciliation even if those things can't come to be? That's dealing with a very real subject in the world. Even if maybe the divorce happened for terrible reasons, right? Like, God changes hearts. So when God changes that heart, if in his providence that's after things have already been reformatted to a way restoration can happen, well, then we have to look for the other ways we can be brothers and sisters and live with one another in peace and do these things. It is a nice illustration of some of those difficulties.
Yeah, it's kind of where the movie lands, where you have so Charlie goes from not wanting to spend any time with his dad to wanting to be only with his dad, and by the end, there's this Scott/Santa says, "I can't be selfish. We are a family. Me, you, your mom, and Neil."
Yeah.
Yeah. He chokes on the words as he says
Despite
them.
that pointed head.
It's funny. Yeah. It's funny. I mentioned the sequels earlier, and we're not going to spend much time on those, but I do think that is a follow-up to this point, because what happens in the Santa Claus 2 is that it jumps, they wait 8 years to make it because it's a cash grab. But anyway, and so in that process, Neil and whatever the mom's name was, have a daughter, and she's about 8 years old or 10 or something like that. And she's a key character in the second and third movies. And what we see is that Charlie lives with them and with his half sister, and they have this great relationship. I don't know. I think that's a really good illustration that this divorce, which obviously was a tragic thing, brought about this beautiful life, and that we see this remarriage, we see reconciliation with even Pinhead Neil. He's not a doctor; he's a psychiatrist.
Very true.
He listens to me. When you pay him.
And then he charges you. Well, and it's interesting too because there's this, heroism that Charlie sees in his dad, which is a stark contrast to what we see his view of Scott is in the earlier part of the first movie, such that there's this great moment in the second movie where you can tell that this secrecy is really wearing at Charlie because he's much older at this point. And he says, my friends get to go around saying, my dad's a plumber, my dad's a pilot, my dad's a dentist. You know what? My dad's the best thing of all, and I can't tell anyone about it. And he's just carrying that, and it leads to him being this really angsty teenager and all of that business. And, while those movies are a little cheesy and campy in some ways, I think they really see the way that something like that would wear on a child that is, a teenager at that point. So I don't know. I think that it's, like you said, there's it's a commentary for sure of where our culture is on these issues of divorce. But ultimately we see that brokenness can be redeemed, not by magic and not by Santa Claus and the magic of Christmas, but by relationship with God.
Yeah,
and so that's where movies like this aren't going to get us all the way there, but we can redeem some of these points. And
by forgiveness, and understanding, and that's how they work with this family for the sake of loving Charlie. Yeah, there is something like exactly like you pointed out, something very real about that. That it's like if you're trying to get people in the around the holidays to actually live with the spirit that we know that we should be living with year round. That seems to be what Christmas is often about, where people are like, they're like, I can't be perfect as my heavenly Father is perfect all the time. Let's see if I can do it for one day a year or 1 month a year. It's the most wonderful time of the year. Seems to be kind of the way people behave, even if Christians or non. It seems to be kind of the way the Christmas spirit is supposed to be kind of interpreted in our culture.
Yeah, it seemed to me like when you're talking, David, that we talk about that moment where the kid's like, you're the best thing in the world and I can't talk about you. Like, what a stark contrast to sadly some Christians today, right? It's like we claim that we have the most wonderful Father and have been saved by the most wonderful Son. Like, so shouldn't we? And we have free rights and, in fact, a commission to talk about it and tell others that, our God is Jesus, not my dad's
the clause,
a plumber.
if you will.
Yeah.
Chris Kringle.
Yeah. And so isn't it funny that we don't, even though we claim to believe the most incredible thing in the world? Like that, to me, that sort of gets us, maybe that cracks open a little bit about what this movie talks about in regards to just belief and belief in action, right?
I was going to say, Popcorn Theology, dishing out hard pills to swallow since 2015. Or in James's case, since whenever your book came out.
Every once in a while, one of us lands on a point, and the other, like, all of us get kind of quiet, like, oof, I should go pray now or something. No, I should go evangelize.
Excuse me, I need to go.
I should tell people. But
now,
yeah,
Miles, I know you got lots to say about belief.
Yeah, this theme of if a major theme of this movie is just the belief of a child. So if we're talking about the spirit of Christmas, there's this idea that children carry the spirit of Christmas, and Santa, this whole Santa tradition and what Santa Claus does keeps it alive. And this movie is almost like it almost died because Santa himself didn't believe, and it took the undying faith of a child to reignite that. It's like a smoldering whisk or a bruised reed was all that it was to be able to ignite the spirit of Christmas again. And so Scott, in a very, very real way, is rescued by his son, because at the beginning of the movie, Scott wants Charlie believing in Santa Claus the way a lot of people do. Like, I just want my kid to have imagination, And if we're going to destroy his illusions, I'd rather be a part of it, And then Neil's like, well, we need to have him have a firm grasp on reality, The psychiatrist, I'm not sure if it's healthy for a child development, you're losing your mind. But it's really this faith of a child that is in the face of all the adults and everybody that
Yeah.
that keeps the spirit of Christmas alive. It's Charlie who's the hero in that sense.
Well, and we see Neil there with his, you need a firm grasp on reality. It really seems like he's the kind of guy who's appealing. What does he say? Santa's it's more a state of mind than a person. It's like
Kind of like Neil. Yeah.
yeah.
Nice, you're channeling Tim Allen right there.
Yeah. But I suspect he's one of those guys who is trying to ultimately ground the child in the idea that the material world's all there is, right? It's a very worldly thinking. And we certainly don't want, as I just said earlier, like I'm not big on the indulge their ignorance of the reality of Santa Claus. But when it comes to the things beyond the material world we would say are valuable and worth believing in, it's like, well, wait a minute. I don't even like Tim Allen's defense. See, you have Neil at the beginning of the movie kind of against believing in things that are beyond this world. But then Tim Allen says something, Scott says something ultimately more like, I think it's Charlie's asking him questions about how Santa fits down the chimney and all these other things. And Scott defaults to that bad Christian answer. Just don't think about it. Whatever. Just blind faith.
Just quit asking. Yeah.
It doesn't have to make sense or be reasonable. It's like, whoa. Like Scripture actually admonishes us and tells us to always be prepared to have a reasoned articulation, a reasonable defense of our faith. Like we serve a God. Like somebody asks, well, how could God do this? Well, let's talk about God's immutability. Let's talk about God's, eternality. Like we're actually called to have answers for God, not squeezing down chimneys, but actually much bigger things, parting Red Seas, walking on water. Like we're actually called to be able to talk and speak to these things, and not just be dismissing as, oh, whatever, you just got to believe. So I don't like either men's version of how to view this at the beginning of the film, but I think later we get a better explanation of belief. We'll get to that.
For sure, yeah. And that's the thing is that what ultimately happens is that we go into this story with Charlie doubting his beliefs because of a mean kid at school and then, a psychiatrist in the house. And
psychiatrist in the house!
in the hizzy. But ultimately, his dad is trying to convince him that he believes in Santa Claus when it's pretty apparent that he just wants Charlie to believe. He doesn't really believe. He doesn't want to believe in Santa Claus. Even as they encounter the real Santa, they're transformed by this experience, quite literally in the case of Scott. He starts undergoing physical changes, but they react to this very, very differently. Charlie believes with no difficulty. He has the faith of a child, illustrated so well in comparison with the sort of jaded views of an adult here. Scott excuses what he's seeing as a delusion. Oh, this must be a dream. Like I know enough about reality that even the things I'm experiencing can't possibly fit into that. So as real as all of this seems, what a delightful reality, or what a delightful dream and illusion this must be. And he's finding ways to make excuses to himself.
Yeah.
I think ultimately this movie might be a decent case study in presuppositionalism, but we'll talk more about apologetics here in just a moment. But we even get this description of from Judy the elf that she says most grown-ups can't believe in magic. It just sort of grows out of them as sort of a casual throwaway statement that children have a faith in magic that adults simply don't have the capacity for. Which is a fascinating way to explain, within the context of this story, why adults all seem to falsely think that there is no Santa Claus, wink, wink. But ultimately, it points to what Scripture indicates as the faith of a child. I just thought it was really interesting on this viewing.
And the term grows out of them kind of cuts in multiple ways, because really when you look at the mom and Neil, it's like, it didn't grow out of them. It was choked out of them by a hard experience. And so there's something about the older you get, the more you live, you're trying to protect yourself from pain. There's themes in a popular movie that's come out recently about disappointment and the way you shield yourself from disappointment. That that might also contain somebody in red who has amazing powers.
Moving on.
And sometimes you can...
I thought you were talking about The Princess Bride. Get used to disappointment.
Get used to disappointments. But yeah, that's often what happens is that people they don't want to look like a fool. They feel like they've got they're protecting themselves, and so the belief, because a lot of belief contains hope, but children are vulnerable by nature, and they just end up having to trust. That's like in James says, the poor of the world have been made rich in faith, because the poor know that they aren't surviving on their own. Bootstraps, all that kind of stuff.
Bootstraps.
And so the faith of the child is depicted in this movie, and ends up, even though what it has a belief in, and some of the way they talk about it, it's something like not the reject, not the receive, but probably the redeem aspect of this movie. But it also shows the stubborn will of Scott, as he's not believing, even though he's physically changing. He's changing from the the inside and the outside. His heartbeat is changing. He's receiving a new heart, and he's rejecting it.
I hadn't thought about that till this viewing. Yeah, he starts to change. Obviously, the heart changed inside. Now it taps out Carol's, and then his body's changing, and his attitude's changing before he even knows it too. Like when he disrupts the boardroom conversation about Santa's tank, and then he walks out. He's like, I don't know what's wrong with me, because I hadn't thought about it until this viewing. We have a very sovereign and dare I say reformed view of God here, who like to say a change is initiated in him, even somewhat despite him, and he's changing in ways he doesn't even understand. It's much less his choosing and his will, but definitely God, definitely the magic's choosing, or the Santa Claus's choosing, and a will actually kind of just transforming him from the inside out, which is something I think as Christians, to one degree, we all do see and agree to. Like, that's something that happens in us, no matter how we might quibble about the order of salvation in some of that sense. But it happens.
I was going to say,
it's a really good picture.
This movie seems to make that case of a phrase that I've heard from some of my more reformed friends. Regeneration precedes faith, I believe is the phrase, or some version of that. So somewhere Richard's gonna appreciate the way that this movie illustrates that, because ultimately you're right, he is changing, but still in denial of it. You're in denial, as Charlie tells him.
Sometimes
may not know what that means, but
our behavior doesn't quite match up what we really believe. Like Scott's experiencing this changing, or I think David, you put this in the notes, is like for a while Scott is his behavior in reference to Santa Claus is kind of like the person who goes to church for the sake of their kids. I want my kids to receive good morals. And I'm happy to have them in church, but sometimes the kids come to faith and then the parents follow. And so like that's oftentimes I'll listen to the people who are involved with their kids ministry. And it's like, we want to disciple the kids in order to reach their parents, because oftentimes their parents are hard-hearted toward us, but they have just this little kind of, for the sake of the kids, let's have them experience this, because there is something good here, even if I reject it.
That's a great analogy, because in a way, he inadvertently brings his kid to church, i.e. the North Pole, right? Yeah. And his kid buys into it even before he gets caught up into it eventually. But I have seen several parents, even at the church I'm pastoring at now, like they freely confess they kind of came back just with their kids, and their faith became more genuine and earnest in that process. And that's a very real deal that I think sometimes we, maybe as Christians, will mock that as like, well, but God will use that. So we don't ever want to stymie that we don't want to scoff at it in a way that makes the parents drop out and stop bringing their kids.
I had a little girl when I was teaching Sunday school say, I became a Christian first, and I remember like hiding in my closet when my parents fought. And it's like, but I became a Christian first, and now they're Christians, and now they're. Yeah. I think that family did get divorced, but I was just really impressed with her. Like, she's like, I did it first. She was like almost a little too proud, but just faith like a child, boldness like a child, telling me her story about how she came to faith first and the parents followed. Yeah. That's very similar for Scott. Like,
because at the one point he's saying, I see this and I don't believe it. And Judy, who, I think we all love Judy, right?
She's great.
She's wonderful. Brings hot chocolate, cute little.
But she's seeing somebody in rapping, just remember.
Yeah.
But she says
that's so funny.
Oh, yeah. She says, you're missing the point. Seeing isn't believing. Believing is seeing. Kids don't have to see this place to know that it's here. They just know. And I felt like, well, not 100% perfect or in context, of course, this is a much better version of belief being defined, and even then belief being commended. I was thinking of John 20. Jesus is talking with Thomas, and of course Thomas is demanded to see and to stick his fingers in his hands and his side, see the nail scars. And Jesus says, Thomas says, "My Lord and my God," and Jesus says, "Have you believed because you've seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And so it's not as if like Thomas believes, and in one sense that belief isn't being disparaged, but there is this idea. It's like, those who just saw the empty tomb and were praising God, like, more power to them. Like they didn't have to see and have all of this evidence to get it. They didn't want to. It wasn't a blind faith, but it also wasn't absolute, sort of exhaustive, detailed knowledge. I think most Christians ride somewhere in the middle there, right? Like, we're told to have a reasoned defense for our faith, but we don't have what the world would demand as scientific proof and the exact evidence that they would want. We have evidences, but not anything that I think anyone is ever at the end of the day prepared to say is 100% conclusive.
Yeah.
It's
like the skeptic often demands, how could God allow this thing, this particular evil or whatever? And you're like, well, I don't have enough evidence to figure out why this is part of the plan, but I do have enough evidence to know that there is a plan. And if you're willing to actually see through the eyes of faith, if you're even willing to just grant me for a second this, your eyes might actually be open to this.
Yeah. Well, and some people like Scott just refuse to see it, like him even standing on the on the balcony looking out at everything. They see it and refuse to see it. And I think Romans even talks about how we suppress the truth in our unrighteousness, and that in one sense we do know. But I was even thinking, we referenced the old Rich Man and Lazarus a couple podcasts back, and there's a moment where the guy who like Scrooge is now like Scrooge's dark vision of his future. He's sort of or I guess that'd be his buddy Marley, right? Is in chains. I was watching a version of the Christmas Carol this morning, and Marley gets to come back and be that spirit who says, beware, don't be like me. And in Scripture, we actually are told, Jesus tells this story of a rich man in hell, and he's begging, like, well, let me go back, let somebody go back and warn and tell my Ebenezer, tell my family, like I want to be like Jacob Marley and get the message back. And Jesus says, hey, if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they'll not be persuaded, even if somebody rises from the dead. He's saying, like, some people will see and still just deny. Like, it wouldn't even matter if a dead man showed up. It wouldn't matter if Marley showed up with his chains. Some people, like Scott in that moment, will just always refuse to see. But fortunately, Scott gets changed, right? So Scott does have the experience.
And Charlie sees it. So we've got the faith of the child. I know who you are, Dad. You'll figure it out soon enough. Which leads into the comedic adventure of, I called Santa Claus as the reluctant prophet or convert, that parallel. And so he puts on the pants merely because Charlie's saying stuff like, how come everything I want to do you think is stupid? Yeah. And he's just trying to reach his son.
And because he's in his underwear and he's cold.
Yeah. So he puts on...
This story could have gone so much differently if he had worn pajama pants out the door. He may not have worn the full outfit. To think of it that way. Yeah. Or if he actually slept the way he yelled to the neighbors, "Buck naked." The story could have gone very differently. I'm very glad it didn't.
And because he puts on the pants, he initiates contractually binding the Santa Claus, which the Santa Claus, it took me a while to get this. So the Santa Claus reads, in putting on the suit and entering the sleigh, the wearer waives any rights to any previous identity, real or implied, and fully accepts the duties and responsibilities of Santa Claus in perpetuity until such time as the wearer becomes unable to do so by either accident or design.
Breathe, Miles.
I've always wanted to see if I could do
like the side effects include type thing. I'm also curious what previous identity, real or implied.
Yes, that's so funny. It's just, and I love when he's reading along with Bernard and it's zooming in on his mouth and he's like all skeptical looking up his nose. But really it's like, and then he summarizes, in putting on the suit, you become the big guy. But I love this language. You, like, the wearer waives any rights to any previous identity. Fully accepts the duties and responsibilities of Santa Claus. And so if we want to take this idea of regeneration, faith, election further, it's funny, this is a good picture of election. It's like God chooses you, like sovereignly chooses you, But for this, it's stepping into the pants. But imagine if there's providence
I
behind
was going
it.
to say, however,
Yeah.
actually, I'm just kidding.
Actually,
Well, you could say
he put on. He chose to put on. He used his free will to put it on. I'm just kidding. I'm
right.
just giving
Well,
you guys
no,
a hard time.
there is choice making involved in the story, and I think that's
Yeah.
even I think that is even true in an honest explanation that even deals with some of these concepts we're talking about. Like in one sense,
Yeah,
you could say
for
like
sure.
like before the foundation of the earth, it was known that Scott would. He didn't knock him off the roof. He's
no, he just said, "Hey, you."
startled him a little bit, but
But it does also look on the roof. If you look at it, it looks like that was there was a perfectly shoveled path. So there's snow everywhere else on the roof except for where Santa Claus falls down. And so
Because it wasn't the first take.
So Scott Calvin arranged for some person working on the set that day to shovel a perfect path for Santa Claus to fall off. That took me out of the movie for a second. I was like,
I tell you,
have
what
him
took
slip-
me out of the movie was a man falling 5 feet into snow and dying.
yeah, I've jumped off of roofs in the snow. You're all right.
I'm like, how would that kill him? Poor frail old man.
But what
Anyway.
happens if I fall off a roof? He's got his. I liked the elf Q with a little British. It's like it looked exactly like a James Bond equipping. him
Oh,
with
Q? Yes.
Little Q.
Yeah.
Oh, it's great. But so he puts on the suit. Santa Claus, the name of the movie. He takes on this identity, a new legal identity that's separate from his self-conception or anything else. My favorite identity verse in Scripture, Galatians 2:20, Paul says, "I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me."
yeah.
So it's like, man, I certainly wish that sanctification worked the way the Santa Claus, where he's always automatically getting plump. I guess it is kind of like the fruit of the Spirit coming out of you, and you're not even being aware of it. That's kind of where I'm going with this.
Well, it's great. Romans also talks about being conformed to the image and likeness of the Son, right? So we want to more and more be conformed to that image. He's being conformed to the image of Santa here in this story. And of course that involves a lot of physical manifestations, which we wouldn't attribute it to. But yeah, we're going through all of these. We hope as Christians that our sanctification involves some changes that we do feel powerless to make. Sometimes in our heart dispositions, our cheerfulness, like we can start to sacrifice and be givers, but we're also praying that God has the heart match those actions, so that we're not just doing it out of perfunctory duty, but we're doing it out of Spirit-led joy in the midst of it. So like there's, and I think Scott faces that too, right? Some changes are happening, but others it seems like he has to struggle with in terms of personality and disposition and his desire. Like I think there is, like we talk about progressive sanctification as Christians, God invites us into that struggle, and it's almost like he's giving us, he feeds it at his pace and makes us struggle in the midst of it. So sometimes we do wake up with a few extra pounds of fruit of the Spirit, but sometimes he makes us, to get on eat the fudge or something ourselves and sort of pack it on.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
And like all of these comedic, like him being a reluctant convert, a reluctant prophet, symbol, reminded me of prophets in Scripture. Like Jonah was the most reluctant prophet, and God sends him into God says, "Go up to Nineveh." He goes down, 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 even down to the bottom of the boat, and then God sends a storm, and then he has to be in the belly of a great fish and covered in vomit, spit up on the shore. That all that kind of the comedy of the reluctant prophet who thinks that they can run from their identity and their calling is it reminds me of this whole Scott suppressing the truth of him being Santa Claus. And
You've almost got me
similarly,
wanting a Tim Allen movie version of Jonah.
he could do it. Yes, like I hate these people.
Oh, come on. Oh, yeah.
And Jonah is really a tragedy. That's that story, but I don't think we have time
Yeah,
to get into
yeah.
that one, or
No,
even
we don't.
one of the greatest prophets, Moses.
Yeah, yeah.
A lot of people forget how reluctant he was after spending the time away, after having killed the Egyptian. At one point, he pleads, "Oh Lord," after giving these excuses, I can't speak well. How would they know if it's who sent me, this or that? Eventually, he just gets down to the real heart of Moses, and he says, "Oh my Lord, please send someone else." In Exodus 4:13, and that's where we get the Aaronic, the priesthood of Aaron, is like God's. It seems to be if Moses had just obeyed, you might not have had the priesthood of Aaron, but it even changes the shape of the Exodus, how reluctant Moses is to take on this mantle.
Isn't that ironic?
I sure missed you guys last week.
Groaning back from the dead.
No, this is something I relate to. One of my first sermons I think I preached when I was ordained was actually on Moses and that conversation with God, and that was no mistake or just happenstance. And I've often referred to myself. I've said Jonah is my spirit animal. In that, from the beginning, I know I just said something pagan in the midst of that, but
it's a Christmas tradition, right?
there you go. I'm just mixing it up. But I tried to make those deals with God when I became a believer. Well, when I came back from a long prodigal stretch at 25, and I was just like, well, okay, I'll be a Christian, but I don't want to be involved. I'll serve, but I won't be a deacon. I'll be a deacon, but I'll never be a pastor. And all of these deals, he would eventually wake up and break me, not by just changing my waistline or growing facial hair, or in my case, removing it, but the reluctant convert's kind of the reluctant pastor is how I've always felt. Like that. This was I earnestly, before I was 25, it was the one thing I was certain I did not want to be. And so movies like this are kind of funny in that sense, because like, oh yeah, no, I know this routine. I know this stubborn trying. All right, I'll do this, but not this, X, but not Y, Y, but not Z. Oh, well, I guess we got the whole alphabet here.
There you go. Kicking and screaming, if you will.
Yes.
Thing, right? So you entered the Pastor Claus, starring James Harlan.
There you go.
Man, yeah, it's just great seeing the journey that he goes on, because he goes from reluctant convert, reluctant believer. It's the faith of Charlie that launches him into actually taking on his identity, and then eventually he's embracing Santa Claus, and now it's time for Santa Claus to go face the skeptics, face his antagonists toward the end of the movie. So we have Neil representing the skeptic, representing in the 90s the new dad that you're now in competition with, that was chosen by your ex-wife, and you have and you're finally getting...
I was going to say, and my apologies. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I don't have anything particularly good. We'll cut that one out. All right.
I was just going to clarify a point real quick. So I'll make it sound good. And ultimately, even before Scott believes, his Charlie is acting as his apologist in a way. He's sitting there making the case. There's this fascinating dialogue between him and Neil that, again, this is a great movie to watch again with popcorn theology glasses on, which now makes me wish we actually had physical popcorn theology glasses, but we don't.
Coming soon to the merch store.
Merch store.
I was going to say
that.
This is a really great one to watch in this context, because ultimately what we see, not only the faith of a child, we see apologetics, and we see, the role of evidence. And so, Scott is already finding ways to excuse in his mind, like, oh yeah, Judy was the waitress's name, and then my dream, and it was all a dream. So he's rejecting the truth in his stubbornness. And then we see questions from Neil, the skeptic, saying, how could one man visit all the children of the world? And Charlie, a child, is trying to answer them, but ultimately kind of giving his idea of it. Well, like, not everyone celebrates Christmas. Something about a time continuum in the sleigh, which I think that's interesting.
You would need that, mathematically speaking. Yeah. But yeah.
I'm picturing the Speed Force in the Flash.
Yeah, that Speed Force. Another. Yeah. So I thought we were covering a podcast about a guy who moves super, super fast and wears red, right?
Yeah, wears a red suit, right?
But I like that. So Charlie gives these answers that at the beginning of the movie would seem crazy to you, but you've now seen them. You've seen Santa doing the squeezing into Jell-O and stuff, and he's just answering from experience, which is actually kind of what it's like sometimes talking to a non-believer. When you'd be like, I don't know how to describe to you what happens when I am so angry I want to strike somebody, and I pray, and the Holy Spirit takes the anger scoops it out of my heart like an ice cream scoop. I can't describe what that's like to have the peace of God that surpasses my understanding wash over me, but I want you to experience it. And so similar to this.
Exactly. Have you ever experienced speaking with God? Well, of course I have. It's like when Neil asks him, have you ever seen a reindeer fly? Yes. He tells- well, I haven't, and to that point, it's like, have you ever encountered and spoken with God? Have you ever spoken with a divine entity? Not the way that Moses did, no, but
No.
in our own ways we have. And so for a skeptic, that's a similar moment. Well, I haven't. And it's like, well, you can.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Some of these explanations, like he goes like Jello through the chimney and he goes through like that. You're right. That's absurd sounding in the same way that a lot of the stuff that we would say regarding, the evidence related to apologetics, Jesus just walks on top of the water. You know what I mean? He just came back from the dead, that kind of, it's just going to sound ridiculous to them, but
he
but
does
it's the truth.
a good form of apologetics. It's really good to ask people questions to analyze their own assumptions. And so Neil is asking him, have you ever seen a reindeer fly? Yes. And then Charlie, have you ever seen $1 million? Just because you haven't seen something doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Boom.
Which could be used. That's not proof,
Yeah.
No.
But it's a good way of, in his own kid way, he's attacking Neil's assumptions, which
Yeah.
is a really good tactic if you're having a genuine debate with somebody, because oftentimes whatever you're talking about is only surface level, and he gets kind of foundational to Neil. And another thing about this movie is that apologetics, I think, is also pastoring, and pastoring is often apologetics. So when you're doing apologetics, it's often like you're hitting these arguments and you're bringing in like a sledgehammer. But eventually you get to a point where you've gotten through all the brick walls and there's a heart sitting there. And if you still have the sledgehammer, you're going to crush it.
Yeah.
And so all of these debates get to the final point where Neil is open enough to have that really heart-wrenching story about how he loses faith in Santa Claus at 3 years old because he didn't. I woke up and no weenie whistle.
Which is a whistle that might suit him very well.
No.
Yeah. It's so much fun to beat up on Neil.
Zing. Yeah.
It was just hanging right there. I had to go for the low-hanging fruit.
But yeah, no, you're right. I mean, that's a really good point. I love that analogy too, smashing through the walls. I'm going to have to keep that in mind, because ultimately, you're right that it's not uncommon for some Christians to become such warrior apologists that they maybe neglect the pastoral aspect of it. And I get that tendency. I mean, there's an angst involved. There's a frustration involved. There's if they're doing it, I can do it, responding in kind. That can all happen. But ultimately, that's not what we see Christ's example looking like. That's not the way that we see the apostles acting in Scripture necessarily.
They knew when to use the boxing glove and when to use the velvet glove. I think that's something.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like Saint Nick, the actual Saint Nicholas, went around just decking everybody. You know what I mean?
It was one, and it was probably something I bet he regretted it. I don't know. It's a wonderful story of Saint Nick smacking Arius, smacking a heretic.
But we do have to be careful, like you were saying. There are people who have had outside influences negatively impact their faith. And we would say everyone has their own sin issues to deal with, so we can't... there's very much a trend today for people to blame it all on the outside, because that's the way our world deals with it. Like, you're inherently good, and just the world is then systemically screwed up somehow, so all of your pains and hurts come from the exterior. We'd say, no, there's a lot of terrible sin suppression, self-deceiving going on in the human heart. But that doesn't mean that there haven't been negative impacts coming in, sometimes from parents, sometimes from culture, sometimes from peers, like whatever it is. And so making sure, like you said, the sledgehammer or the boxing glove may need to get through some of those exterior walls, but then when you're getting close to a heart, or when the heart is exposed, like, wow, that needs some embrace and some tenderness there. And that's what they get in the movie, right? That's so sweet when the presents drop, right? They get the mystery date game and the weenie whistle. And it's sweet. It's almost schmaltzy sweet, but yet it kind of works. I mean, it does work.
Yeah. They sold it, because they sold the bitterness well. It's a good transformation. Yeah. And everyone was better for it. Everybody grew in this story. There really is a great sense of everybody progressing in this story emotionally, even though, like we were talking about before the podcast, it clips by at 90 minutes. The movie is so short. It seems to jump from the conflicts and stuff. It's not a narratively tight movie. It's like,
no, we can nitpick. The timeline's fascinating too, because we're told in the movie what the timeline will be, and then they seem to ignore that.
Yeah.
Like 11 months later, this will happen. And I'm like, I'm sorry, did 11 months pass? It felt like a weekend.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, sorry. That was my nitpick on that. And then also there are a couple of like really campy 90s things in this movie. Like almost can't be ignored. But it's okay. It's acceptable because like you said that there was a lot of emotional heft to this, a lot of deeper themes being explored, particularly for a Tim Allen Christmas movie than you might expect. So yeah, I'm really glad that our patron saints chose this one for sure.
Instead of home improvement, this is movies about heart improvement.
Aww. I'll try not to groan. I'm going to try and groan less. I'm trying to grow in that way. Fantastic. Well, I appreciate our patron saints choosing this one. And, if there's enough demand, maybe we can cover It's a Wonderful Life sometime in the spring. I
would do it.
Seems like people are pretty burned about that. That's fine.
I wouldn't be surprised. I think the film actually came out in January. Mm-hmm. It didn't come out at Christmas originally. So maybe the next month or two, they'll make us do it as a winter podcast. And that'd be fine.
There you go. Yeah, absolutely. I look forward to that. And I think that there's a lot more discussion to be had out of both movies. And as far as any other aspects of this, I would love to see threads going on in the Facebook group, even on Twitter, in the Discord server, just related to Santa Claus. Maybe parents who have young kids that are like, hey, how do you guys navigate the Santa Claus business? There's, or hey, I know someone who seems to be a reluctant convert, or I'm a reluctant convert, or something like that. Hopefully some themes from this episode can spark discussions, whether it's with people in your church or in your home, or people on social media that you've never met in person, like these guys. I've never met. Well, no, I've met James in person once.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I hope that keeps going, and our various social media platforms. So find those, click the links in the show notes to do that. Consider supporting us on Patreon so that you can vote on the next episode. Maybe if you really wanted It's a Wonderful Life, your one vote could have swayed this.
1 or 2 votes would have done it. Yep.
Yeah, that's all it would have taken. And so your votes have quite a bit of power here. So, and then if you haven't bought Christmas presents, it's probably a little late for them to show up by Christmas. But we also have the merch store, so that's something worth checking out as well if you're interested. So, in the meantime, everyone, keep engaging media from a godly worldview, and remember, you are not a mindless consumer.
Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night.
And tomorrow I'm getting a CAT scan.